Hey y'all, it's Morgan, one of your hosts for the Connections podcast. Today on this episode, we have Chris Hart, and he's answering some questions like, what do we do with data in the substance use field? And how do we actually quantify something that's as subjective as recovery? So let's hop on into this episode and hear what he has to say.
Welcome to Connections, the podcast from addiction professionals of North Carolina, where we explore the nuances of addiction and mental health through the lens of policy and practice.
We're your hosts, Morgan Coiner
and Sara Howe,
and we're here to help you see how it all connects.
Today, I'm thrilled to have with us Chris Hart, the Chief Data Analytics Officer at Third Horizon Strategies, to join us to talk about recovery capital and how we connect data to practice. So Chris, welcome to the show. We're glad to have you.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
That's a mouthful of a title. So tell us what you really do every day.
Yeah, so this is a great question. I wish I could boil it down into a small little soundbite. I spend a lot of my time on what we call the back end. So that is in a lot of data systems. So at Third Horizon Strategies, we have a number, as you know, Sara, of engagements that are happening across the country. My job is really to build out data platforms that allow us to move data and research and analytics, which can be most helpful and useful to those that are working to better our communities across the country.
That's great. And for our listeners who say, what are we going to talk about with data for the next 15 to 20 minutes? How are we going to keep this interesting? I promise you, there's so much here where there's that connection between what we're doing and how we measure it and what it says about what we're doing, and particularly in this recovery space. And that's really what I want to dig into, because we can go down a lot of rabbit holes, but where I really want to start is talk to us about your work in recovery capital and what you're seeing and what our listeners who may not be part of this field at all need to know about it.
Yeah, so recovery capital is it's just a really interesting sort of area. So maybe we'll just do this through a little bit of exploration, amongst us, because I know, Sara, you and I, and certainly Morgan, have had conversations about this particular topic and how it relates to the broad work that we do on a day-to-day basis. But let's just start with some context, right? So when we talk about recovery capital, we're really talking about it in reference to recovery from a substance misuse or substance use disorder. Although I will say right from the very beginning that recovery capital, as it's defined, is really a breadth of domains of interest that extend far beyond sort of the idea of recovery and really are more akin to the journeys that we kind of all go on in our personal well-being. So it's reflective of sort of how is it that we're really striving to live our best life, right? How is it that we are reclaiming, if we've lost something, our sense of identity? How is it that we are sort of moving into a life that is satisfying, that is fulfilling, that's purposeful, et cetera? And that's really the essence of what we mean when we talk about sort of recovery capital. But maybe just to take a step back for a moment, because I've had the honor really of working with a large number of professionals over about a 10-year period or so, which is defined within the recovery science sort of field. And so this is a particular study that's looking at the dynamics of recovery and how does that really happen, and more importantly, how do we support that through our work, through our communities, just through society really at large. And so recovery capital, I kind of trace it back to its emergence is really based upon the historical approach that we had largely taken in this country and in the field through treatment protocols and to research, and that the field was sort of adopting this acute model approach, right? That there is a short therapeutic intervention, and then there's short periods of research that on the follow-up. But the goal really of the therapeutic intervention was a little bit like what you do with a surgical patient, right? It's kind of, you have an intake, there's an intervention, and then there's a discharge, and you're hoping that sort of the treatment is just going to stick, right? It's going to stay with them, and there's limited follow-up in terms of what is happening in the after discharge sort of environment. And so where recovery science really began to emerge was really in the recognition that recovery is this dynamic sort of process that goes through all different stages at a very personal level. And those are stages that will change in terms of what your focus is, or your priorities are, or what you're challenged in. And so, as we began to sort of think about those stages and about the idea of recovery, then really there was work that started to be done around conceptualizing this idea of recovery capital, where recovery capital was defined as both those intrinsic and extrinsic sort of assets that you can draw upon in order to help you through these different stages of recovery. And then it got more formalized as we started to move into the stage of, okay, well, if we start to name these types of things, these assets, these things that can contribute to not only initiating but sustaining recovery, there has to be a way in which we can measure them. And that rose to the advent then of what is a recovery capital assessment. It's a way in which to sort of measure an individual's state, so to speak, in terms of the different domains that relate to recovery capital. So sorry, that was a mouthful, but that was, that's right. Sort of the lead in to recovery capital.
So tell us more about those domains. What are we talking about concretely?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? So initially, recovery capital was postulated as this, large set of domains and assets and resources, and really it was fairly cumbersome to work with. So I think it was around 2013 or so that we saw coming forward what we now call sort of the brief assessment of recovery capital, or the BARC-10 as it's called in short for practitioners. And so that really started to narrow down and just focus on sort of 10 what we would call sort of keystone or core elements that really can contribute to an individual successfully initiating, and research has shown really contributes to the propensity of staying in recovery for a longer term. It also, by the way, correlates to quality of life and levels of stress reduction, et cetera. But the domains are these. I'll just tell you what they are, and then we can sort of reflect on them, because they fall into these macro areas of both social and personal sort of constructs. There's substance use and sobriety, which is an area and domain in which we sort of pay attention to. Then there's global psychological health, global physical health, in terms of how we are doing, on a physical sort of basis. There's citizenship and community involvement, social supports, meaningful activities, housing and safety, risk-taking, coping with life functioning, and the recovery experience at large. Those are the domains that sort of do it. And what's interesting is if you replay and listen to what those domains, as words that were named in there, there's only 2 of them that actually are specific to substances in terms of what that is. Everything else is in that breadth of how is it that we are reclaiming our life, right? How is it that we are going about our well-being journey, so to speak, which is what really recovery is. Recovery is this idea of reestablishing and the self-actualization that goes along with it, out of this experience into a new, whole novel experience that we have, which is now our life in recovery.
I love just hearing all of those domains. The one that popped out to me is the coping with life. You said something along those lines, and before I entered in for recovery, I had this notion. I would see people in recovery and I was like, nothing seems to bother you. How are you able to just handle what gets thrown at you? And that's exactly what it is. You've just sort of been able to put it into a term that we can measure, versus this, I was looking at these people they just have this thing and I don't really get it, but it makes sense. And it's people in recovery who have it. And that's what I saw. And so I love hearing you put the data words beside that to say no, this is a real thing and it's valuable and it means something here, rather than just, an anecdote of me walking into an AA room, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what's interesting about this? So there's a number of different ways to sort of think about that and what you just said, which is really powerful, right, in terms of the notion. And that is, so on the practical side of this, right, this is the idea or the domain that you sort of key in on is the idea that you begin to shift and regard your life. Like the question I would ask you is, you regard your life as challenging, as fulfilling, and it can be that way absent my need to use X, Y, or Z. And so that's how you, from a sort of practical end, are really trying to evaluate, is this something that you have, which is an intrinsic or internal sort of piece of the recovery capital to go forward. But I'm like you. I have always gravitated to in this is that by its definition and by its nature, the idea of recovery capital is asset-based and not deficit-based. And so it is an idea of how are we building back up, right? We've all gone through this experience, and it has brought us to a point, and for some it's much harder than others. But the reality is that we're regaining something and we're trying to move forward. And what I've always been drawn to, and this has been at the essence of what the recovery science field is sort of saying, is that their theory and the reason that this practice has come about is because we need to no longer think about recovery in the pathology, that it is an endpoint or conclusion of a particular therapeutic intervention, but it is a distinct evolutionary journey in and of itself. It's the start of something new. And it is this process that of me going through all of those different things that I need to do to right-size my life and to make what I'm doing meaningful and productive for my definition. That's what makes it so interesting as we sort of go through it. And so I really have always liked the application on a practical end of how is it that we can use recovery capital.
I'm curious as we're having this discussion, Chris. One of our previous guests that we just talked about the intersection of prevention and recovery. And as we step back and we look at the evolution of prevention, where we started with the 40 developmental assets that the Search Institute talked about, 30 years ago now? And
40. Yeah,
almost 40 years ago, 40 assets 40 years ago, and risk and protective factors. And then you're talking about recovery science from an asset-based perspective. These two aren't that far off.
No, in fact, I think they're the same construct.
Your thought on that, and we were just having this conversation about how there's a belief in the field that prevention and recovery are the very far ends, and never the two shall touch. But we continue to have these dialogues where I don't think that's true. Are you seeing that too?
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. So I think. Here's what's really interesting about what you just pointed to, right? So if you take the developmental assets from the Search Institute, right, and you say, okay, this is a leading construct by which we think about sort of prevention, and then you were to really think about what are the 40 developmental assets, so to speak, what do they contribute to? Right. And what they're contributing to is they're contributing to people building up resiliency and adaptability and all the different things that go into positive development, particularly as we related on the youth end. And then you look at the measurements of those developmental assets, and you're saying what it's doing is it's more is better. It's the abundancy of those sort of assets, right? So when you begin to really look at the differences between classes of youth that are only able to have access or exposure to 10 or so of the 40 developmental assets versus the class that has 30 to 40 in terms of their access. It's remarkable, we all know, the differences between the two in terms of likelihood to do X, Y, or Z harm behavior, et cetera, down the line in terms of academic performance, et cetera. This is the same construct. This is the same idea of saying there are things that we actually can name that contribute to positive and productive journeys in recovery, regardless of how we personally define that. And that's the other aspect of this, is that similar to any well-being journey, my journey and your journey are going to be two completely different things, and both are valid and both are to be acknowledged, but they are at its center built on certain set of assets that have to do with how I'm socially connected, how I'm thinking about myself, my personal strengths, my self-actualization, and those. And what's really powerful is yes, you can think about it as from a data perspective, which we do, which is, oh, we can measure these things. And I can tell you that if you score above a 47 on average, then you have a much higher, probability of staying and sustaining your recovery journey. That's fine. But the real value of it is the way in which we use it and the tool that's sort of applied. And so when you get into things like recovery support services, paraprofessionals, peer recovery support, and you're using a BARC 10 recovery capital assessment, you're not using it so that you can take the assessment and I can tell you, Sara, congratulations, you got this score. That's not what I'm using it for. What I'm using it for is I'm using it to have a discussion about what my journey looks like. And so, the three areas that we sort of focus in on is let's take this information and data, because data can tell us how we're doing at different periods of time and what's going on at this period of time that influenced this or caused this effect or made this change. But really, I'm asking about, evaluating the types of services and how they're affecting the outcomes that I'm looking for personally. They're informing sort of my service choices. They're informing the different types of engagements that I may be in. Morgan, you mentioned, whether or not I'm involved with mutual aid support groups or any types of referrals or any types of services that are in there. And it's really providing me with sort of a measure. We all have our measures and our monitors. I wear it on my wrist, and I'm paying attention to my health and what it is. This is the same idea, right? This is saying, how am I progressing toward my goals in my recovery plan, however that may be determined by me.
And then I think the next overlay, so we talk about prevention, we talk about recovery, we talk about individual assets, and now we want to talk about the community and how does the community connect to this? And we have this term that we've been using for a long time called social determinants of health, where we look at what community assets are available, what your social determinants are, and tell us a little bit more, because they intersect very nicely and dovetail together.
Yeah, I would argue, and so Sara, you and I have had sort of this exploration together, right, to sort of look at this. I would argue not only do they intersect, it's just a natural extension of these things. It's just another way to sort of think about it, right? So, and to me, this is the next stage of really what we talk about when we talk about recovery capital. So if the first stage is a stage of, all right, well, how do we define this, right? And if we can define it, how do we measure it? And how do we turn it into tools that are sort of helpful? For me now, the next stage of this becomes, well, how do we design conditions and environments that actually enable an abundancy of these types of assets that we're talking about? And this right now is so critically important. So when we begin to look at things like, we have all of these policymakers and we have all of these state systems that are making decisions about things like opiate settlement fund distributions. How are those decisions being made? Where is that money being allocated? Well, in that conversation should be and must be, how is it that we are building environments that contribute to the area of recovery capitalization? And instead of introducing an entirely new construct that you have to think about, oh, by the way, you have to look at this framework, you can take the social determinants of health, which are already ingrained in our system as a way in which to help individuals and by extension communities thrive, and just say it's a logical extension of each one of those areas to think about it from a recovery perspective. So when you're thinking about things like economic stability as a component of your social determinant of health, then the extension into recovery capitalization is just having assets available in there that allow for life and job skill training. And when we have reentry, that there are pathways that allow for those opportunities to sort of happen, that we are paying attention to things like transitional housing, recovery housing, that allows us to regain a sense of identity and self within a community and those types of things. So they're all things we need, but there are specific things that help with that recovery capitalization as we sort of think about it. So I think that that's the next wave of where we really take recovery capital.
Well, I think some of that language, like, it makes it easier to apply to the communities because it's language they're comfortable with. It doesn't sound jargony. It doesn't sound like, oh, I'll never understand that. A lot of us have that reaction to the word data. We're like, I'm out, numbers, and so it's language they understand because, like you said, they're not all directly related to substance use. It's, coping. It's something else. And I can get on board with that if I'm just a regular old community member who maybe isn't as involved in the substance use field. I can get on board with just a healthier community when you talk to me about it in words that I understand and care about.
Yeah, and I think that that's right, Morgan. And I think that the the idea here really is that we have plenty of experience and research and background that points us to what works. We have constructs and we have frameworks and we have data that supports that all of this is important. And this is a way in which to step into the conversation and ensure that everybody is aware of, for a certain segment of the population, which is relatively large, that is working through some form of recovery stage, that there are specific assets that can be helpful in that. So if you're having a conversation about a healthy community, you're having a conversation about educational resources, you're having a conversation about housing, you're having these conversations. And so let's just continue that conversation. Educational resources in an area that is supportive of recovery can include things like recovery support and secondary education and recovery high schools and collegiate recovery programs, all things the two of you know very well, right? But this is the way to have that conversation. This isn't coming in and saying, oh, by the way, add numbers 20 through 25 to your list. This is like, you already have this. We just want to make sure that this is something that is being cared for, nurtured, and then made accessible to those that are sort of living within this community to help them thrive.
I think that's so helpful for our listeners who don't do this every day. They're not necessarily on the front lines in the field. They're living, working, breathing, whether they're in recovery, they have a loved one that's in recovery. How do they get engaged? And how do they take these concepts that we talk about every day? But how do you boil that down to what does it mean in my community? Or let's take it even another step further. I'm going to get engaged in that county meeting on that opioid settlement, where that money is going to go. I'm going to go talk to a policymaker, but I'm not really sure what to say about it. This connects that, because I think sometimes the layman's terms of not being in this field, it's like, I don't know, you're all the experts. We're not really sure. Well, this really makes that connection really clear. Is we've already been talking about economic stability, about educational opportunities, infant mortality. I mean, all the numbers, right, that we look at, this connects right back to that. And I think that's what's really exciting about it. Chris, you mentioned something else. I don't want to lose the opportunity. You've been working in the collegiate recovery field for a long time too.
Yeah.
You have an opportunity to tell us and our listeners a little bit more. Yes, Morgan and I can certainly talk about some of the work that APNC does in this area, and we certainly will in a future episode, but I'd love to hear a little bit more of your experience, the evolution that you've seen in collegiate recovery across this country.
Yeah, so in a not so distant past life, so to speak, professionally speaking, I really had what I consider to be one of the most profound sort of life experiences, at least for me personally, and certainly professionally. And so had the opportunity, I think, really to be at I think an important sort of inflection point of where we saw the evolution of what is now relatively wide known as collegiate recovery programs. So at the time period, so this is early 2010 or so, I had the opportunity to visit with a group actually out at the at USC, University of South California, and this was a group of people that were interested in starting this recovery support sort of program on a college campus. And I had some insight into it, but I had relatively limited understanding about what even recovery was or how it would sort of look or operate. And there were a number, I'm going to say, a handful, 10 to 12 sort of collegiate recovery programs, larger demonstration ones, at Rutgers and Texas Tech, et cetera. But for the most part, it was a relatively new idea and new concept. And so at the time period, a philanthropist by the name of Stacy Mathewson was very interested interested, based upon her personal journey of sort of wanting to put some real funds and money behind this, and through an organization that she established that would be eventually known as Transforming Youth Recovery. And we were brought in by Stacy, and we were asked a simple question, which was, if we were going to make available certain grants to institutions of higher education, how would we monitor that, and how would we help expand and build this movement towards collegiate recovery, or what would eventually become collegiate recovery? And so we thought about it for a while, and this won't surprise you, but our answer as we came back, because we actually work and live in Evanston, Illinois, if you don't know, is where Northwestern University is. And at the time period, Northwestern, through their public policy area, was the hub of where asset-based community development was designed. And so Professor McKnight at the time period was somebody who lived down the street, and we went and we would talk to him, and we would say, we're really fascinated by this idea of how asset-based approaches, but particularly capacity building, which is sort of defined as this idea of how do you teach communities of people to learn to help themselves. And you do it by really looking intrinsically at the assets that are available. And this struck us because the fundamental idea here was, at institutions of higher education, it was not that they lacked the capacity, ability, or resources to support students in recovery. They just had no idea what to do. And they had no idea how to put those things together. And so we led with this idea of, we just want to be able to really focus on exposing and having awareness of the assets that can support students in recovery. Because, oh, by the way, Mr. Administrator, Dr. Whoever, you have students in recovery, whether you know it or don't know it. So this will be something that will be of critical importance for your educational community, for your culture, for your retention, et cetera, down the line. And it would come to pass, by the way, through the data, that it actually is significant in terms of student success, academic achievement, far superior in terms of students that are in recovery. But that aside, so we designed this fairly simple grant program. And it was that they would gift, the foundation would gift a certain amount of money to the institution, and in return, you had to do two things, and two things only. Number one was you had to serve students in recovery. Number two is you had to map your community. And so this brought together a group of people. We gave them all the tools for asset mapping, and this was old school when we used to do it in the Canvas on clipboards, right, in terms of doing it. But we actually built, at the time period, the first database system that would allow for this data to be collected. I'll never forget that when we first did this, and we set out this group of students, and at this time period it was at USC, and they did all the inventories and they came back. We were expecting them to come back and give us lists of, here's where the support meetings are, here's where the counselors are, here's where the groups are. And they did that. But they also came back with, here's Mike's coffee shop, and here's this other establishment in town. And we would ask them, why are you giving me that as an asset in this? And they're because Mike's in recovery. And Mike owns this coffee shop. And if you find yourself stressed out, it's late at night, you don't feel you have a safe place to go, Mike's going to open the coffee shop and he'll let you study there. And so that blew open for us the idea, of what an asset actually was. And anyways, from there, it ultimately, this funding extended to about 180 institutions. We collected the largest database of recovery assets as it related to the institutions of higher education. And then, long story short, it eventually would then transfer over to Google, who used it as the basis by which to create Google Recover Together. And so all of this was from the initial starting point of students deciding that this was something that they wanted to do, but they did it by saying, we're just going to identify those things that are going to help us not only sustain our recovery, but thrive in our academic experience in what we were doing.
I think that's, I think you said it earlier, but bottom line, recovery is about how do we thrive in our lives, and so obviously we talk about recovery from substance use disorders, but there's recovery from eating disorders and mental health. And all sorts of different things. We're really just like, what more can we want out of life but to thrive, and live a life that we love and we're proud of. And I just love, like I said, to be able to put this kind of language and science around it to make it not just a touchy-feely dream, but something that's actually backed by evidence and matters,
In a state that's prioritized, like collegiate recovery. One of the largest, if not the largest, systems of collegiate recovery in the country that has taken that ball and run with it. That's exciting to see and to hear the background, the origin story. I love it.
The origin story is great, and I will say that NC was strong in its early involvement and state in particular, in terms of testing those early tools of getting out and understanding how to do sort of asset mapping. But that really became the foundation. And Morgan, I think you're exactly right. And Sara, you mentioned this earlier. I think these are all constructs by which to define things of the same nature. So whether we talk about developmental assets, whether we talk about recovery capital, or in the well-being world, we talk about the domains of general well-being, certainly physical, but behavioral health, and even financial, social, and community well-being. Those are all domains that we just named, but they're all toward the same end goal. And the same end goal is, how is it that we as individuals can just live our best life, right? How is it that we can thrive in what our settings are? And that should really drive the way in which we think about it from a policy perspective, a planning perspective. And what data is providing is a way in which just to see these things, evaluate them, and say, oh, let's do more of that and let's do less of this as we're planning.
Yeah. Well, I so appreciate, first of all, you taking what people often think is a complex concept and really boiling down to every day, how we look at this every day, and giving us the backstory and how we can take this and really use it practically. It's super exciting. I'm so glad you were willing to take the time to chat with us. Hopefully we'll be able to bring you back for a future episode, particularly as you do more in this area and you start seeing trends. We want to make sure our listeners have an opportunity for it. So thank you so much for being here.
Yes,
my pleasure.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you. Have a great day.
I love what Chris said about recovery not being a destination, that it's a journey. And I love that there are data points that we can point out to see exactly where people are on that journey and that we can use to help people further themselves along. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we did.